Hi, welcome to the podcast on Sapiens. This is the host, Junu Park. Today, in this first episode, we are going to have a conversation about urbanism, urban history, and just basic interesting facts about urban with the urban expert, Andrew Meyers. Andrew Meyers is a co-founder of Living City Project, an experiential and city-based program designed for young urban explorers to explore personal passions, cultivate empathy, actively experiencing and engaging in urban environment, and collaborating to create a diverse and equal community. Right now, it is based on New York City and it offers different programs from City Gap to City Term. Please visit livingcityproject.com to find out more information. Also, Andrew Meyers have dedicated almost 25 years in teaching based on the values of experiential and interdisciplinary learning. He taught at Columbia University, Connecticut College, and Empire State College. He studied history, architecture, and urbanism at Princeton, Yale, and Columbia University. In this particular conversation, we talked about what makes cities so different and special, and what makes an excellent city, characteristics of cities that made humans so successful species in this earth, historical events that totally change the urban history and the future of the city while we are confronting this COVID-19 virus. And since I am a firm believer that the conversation is not solely about information exchange, I have included some personal questions to evoke emotions and also to help listeners to be engaged in imaginations and also personal reflections on their urban life. Also to note, since it's my first time using the USB microphone, I failed to maintain an appropriate distance with the microphone sometimes. So sometimes the audio quality might not be the best. So please bear with that. But I tried my best to minimize the noise distractions by always the editing. So let's delve into the conversation and feel the beauty of the city. Welcome. Thanks for joining the podcast. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Since, as the listeners might not know, me and Mr. Meyers have been exploring the Washington DC before as a part of the education system called CEP. But due to COVID, we were planning to move on to New York, but that's just screwed up. Anyways, so you are right now teaching the students to learn about the city, the cultures, creativities, resilience in the city, and also letting them experiencing and immersing fully into the city life. Then I think there might be some moments or some time when you were a kid or when you were a student when you became fascinated by the urban. So my question is, what fascinates you about this city?
Oh my goodness, yes. First of all, I want to say it's a pleasure to be here with you, Gio. And it's a pleasure to be having a conversation with someone who understands this topic quite well already because of the work we did together in both Shenzhen and in Washington, D.C. with the city's experience program. So it's a pleasure to be with you. Sure. I think when I was a young person, in elementary and middle school in New York City, I grew up in a neighborhood in the Bronx called Riverdale, which is part of the city, but is also a little bit suburban. And so for me, going into, quote, the city meant actually going into Manhattan and Brooklyn. And what I think it represented to me was certainly a kind of excitement, because you never quite knew what was going to happen in the city. I think cities in general they capture change and diversity and cooperation. They are, in a way, a microcosm of the best and worst of our cultures. And so for me, going into the city was kind of going into a sort of magic land where magical things could happen. What one might call serendipity, where you have enough different people and enough interactions going on that these synergies can happen, where you get unexpectedly wonderful and sometimes unexpectedly not so wonderful experiences.
Yeah, you mentioned about the magical moments and serendipity that the urban life can bring to us. Then, do you have any particular episodes that you still remember when you felt those emotions?
Oh my goodness, so many. I mean, I think, so one thing you know quite well is I do experiential walking tours in cities in general, but in New York mostly. And there's so many moments where a student will be presenting, and someone will walk up and start to listen. An older woman, let's say, and the student will finish presenting, and the woman will say, "Oh, well, actually, that's me." She'll have a story. This happened to us. We were working with our group. We have a group of college students who were on leave from college. We call it a city gap. And we were doing work on affordable housing. And we were walking through the Lower East Side, which is a neighborhood in New York City, which was traditionally and is still traditionally an immigrant neighborhood, a working class neighborhood. It's getting gentrified. So it's in transition, but and that brings all sorts of challenges with it. But we were talking about a particular development where a neighborhood had been torn down 30 years ago. Actually, no, I'm sorry, 40 years ago. And because of politics, nothing had been built there. But the people who had been displaced from their homes were promised housing in whatever new thing was built. And so we had a student making a presentation on this, and now all of a sudden, an enormous complex has been developed of mixed use, mixed income housing. And it's pretty impressive, and but not without its problems. And a woman walked up, her name was Christine, and she introduced herself, and she paused and she said, "I was kicked out of my apartment 40 years ago.
Yeah. Wow.
And they called me the other day, and I'm moving into a studio in that building over there." And she pointed to the building. I mean, that just gives you chills. It gives you chills because of what you're learning. It gives you chills because of whom you're meeting. It also gives you chills for the students because, as you and I were talking about a little bit earlier, Gio, when you're talking about something that can be a little abstract, right? Yeah. Housing history and urbanism and displacement and gentrification, and all of a sudden it's made real by this interaction with this person, and it becomes permanently part of your being. It's not just in one part of your brain, it's in all parts of your being. And the students and Christine engaged in this wonderful conversation, and I exchanged cards with her, and she now will on occasion present to our students on her journey. So that's just one. I mean, that's just one of many, many professional examples, and goodness knows so many personal examples. But you have to have the knowledge and confidence to leave yourself open to those kinds of serendipitous experiences.
Exactly. like those special moments and serendipity in the city is actually mostly in most times are linked to the emotions, because urbans also the good the like excellent urbans know how to resonate with the emotions of people, connecting with the past,
Yes,
present, and future. So yeah,
totally.
yeah. So how important is urban to filled with the emotions of different people and different
Oh goodness,
diversity?
that's an
Yeah.
excellent question. You're, you're. I think you're talking in part, at least, about empathy,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
The ability to put yourself in the shoes of other human beings. And I think one thing that New York does, or one thing that cities do, is they force you to encounter other people.
Hmm.
Um, because if you think about what defines cities, density,
Hmm.
and what density means is that you're constantly bumping up against people from different backgrounds and different classes and with different points of view. So that means you kind of have to develop tolerance, right?
Yeah.
Um, but tolerance is a low bar, right? Just tolerating other people really isn't sufficient. What you need beyond that is understanding, right, of other people.
Mm.
And then beyond that, if you do that long enough, you develop empathy. And if all of that happens and everybody's getting along, then you get cooperation. And then with all that infinite diversity contributing to conversations about whatever it is, about race, about class, about gender, about climate change, right? You're going to get better answers when you have empathetic, tolerant, cooperative people working together on a problem or on an issue. And
Yeah.
so I think it's both an emotional piece
Hmm.
and it's a political piece. It's an emotional piece because I think we become better people in the interactions that we have in cities. But
Mm.
it's a political piece, certainly in the United States, because if there's any place where people have to listen to other people and develop some degree of understanding of opposing points of view, it's in the city.
Exactly. Especially in like COVID-19 situations, cooperative and tolerance towards other races and ethnicities is becoming more and more important, as you can see.
Totally.
So yeah, I want to talk about the fundamentals of urbans. Like, what are the components of the city? Like, what makes a city so different from like rural areas?
It's great question. So cities emerge out of exchange. Um, Human beings come together in cities because they need to exchange goods or talent. Um, and so often they emerge around what are called transportation breaks. So New York City is a transportation break between ocean going transportation and river and land transportation. And wherever there's exchange of goods or of skills, um, you have to house people, you have to store goods, you have to develop mechanisms for finance, you have to feed people, you have to feed all those people who are living there, and that produces a city. Um, in the Middle Ages and earlier, the first cities, nature is dangerous and the cities are safe, right? You create
Yeah.
a city to protect yourself from the ravages of nature, from the weather, from marauding bands of attackers, from, in the Middle Ages, it's from robber barons, right? And inside the walls of the city is where you're safe. Um, and so, the history of the city is really the history of humanity. There is no history. There
Mm.
is no real written history until you have cities. And in a way, you can say that there is no humanity until you have cities. If in saying humanity, you don't just mean a species, but a culture of interaction and exchange and of civilization. The word civilization in English, it comes from the Latin civitas, which is the word for city. So civilization just means the stuff that happens once you have cities. And what are those things, right? You have this economic exchange. So you're by this river, right? Because you're moving goods along the river. One group of people comes down, meets another group of people. There's exchange. They create a settlement. They create a marketplace. Then they have to defend that. Then they have to store things. So they create warehouses. Those workers have to live somewhere. They create residences that needs to be defended. They create a wall and an army and a police force. Also, the word police comes from the word polis, which is the Greek word for city. So once you do that, you can specialize, right? You can have people who live in the city who go out of the city and grow food. You have people in the city who turn that food into, turn that like wheat into bread. You have people who make clothes for the people who are going out into the fields. You have people who store all the goods which are being grown outside the city. You create specialization, and that creates leisure. You have, because people are doing things more efficiently, people have some free time. And you create surplus. You create extra stuff that you can sell and exchange and make money off of. And so once you have leisure, you have art, and you have religion, and you have music, and you have performance, all the things which really make us human, right? So yeah. I would argue, I grew up in a slightly suburban neighborhood. I've lived in suburbs. I would argue, though, that it is, and suburbs really are part of cities anyway. But I've lived in the countryside as well. And I would argue that most of the things which make us human require cities.
Yeah, that was a deep answer. So
sorry, I went on.
Yeah. It was a cities, like what I heard, like what I read from the book was that the difference between city and the rural area is that in cities, you will see more strangers. And that was the most, straightforward answer I ever saw. But as I hear your answer, I can see that not only economy, not only specialization, but also as people become more affluent, those leisure activities and also cultural, like those kind of things occur. And I think it's very, it's hard to pinpoint what's the city. And because the history of the humanity is all related to city. Then, I also agree that there is no such thing as urban history, but where did this civilization of the city all started? What's the origin of this thing called city?
The first cities, at least as far as we understand, happen in ancient China and in Mesopotamia, right? Mm-hmm. So we know that there's evidence of archaeological evidence of cities very, very early on in Asia and in Mesopotamia, which is now, I guess people call it the Middle East. And they occur for all those reasons we talked about: protection, prosperity, exchange, right? And then the ancillary products of that are these beautiful, you make the pottery to store the grain in that you're storing in your city, but you're going to decorate that pottery because you want to know what's inside of it. And so art, and because you're creating surplus food and surplus goods, there's some people who can take a little time off, and you get music, right? I'm oversimplifying, obviously. But all of that starts, and you get architecture, and you get, painting and sculpture, and you get all the other disciplines, right? You get economics and history and chemistry, and but you get that because what the city does is it shares the burden.
Yeah,
the city is a machine for figuring out who does what best, and then sharing the efficiencies of that so that you can do more of what you choose to do rather than what you have to do. But it begins, tens of thousands of years ago in those places.
And I have one curious question. Like, you mentioned about the efficiency and the amalgamation with art and music and other cultures. In these aspects, which city do you think has been the most prosperous?
Most prosperous. Oh, good. I
yeah.
thought you were going to ask me my favorite city, and that's like asking a parent who their favorite child is. You can't do that. Which cities have been the most prosperous? Well, that's such a subjective question, because what constitutes prosperity, right? Is it wealth produced per capita, right, per person? Maybe. Mm-hmm. In that case, there are probably. I mean, maybe you'd look at Hong Kong, or you'd look at some tax havens that do that. Is it prosperity in terms of cultural achievement, right? If you're talking cultural achievement, you'd have to look at places like Beijing or Hangzhou or Paris or Barcelona, right? If it's prosperity in terms of transforming, in terms of opportunity, you'd probably have to look at a Nairobi or some Asian cities where people are coming in from the countryside, right, and becoming rich overnight. If you're talking in terms of power, you probably have to look at a place like New York at least in terms of cultural power, global power, and certainly financial power for a time. You'd have to look at New York, again Hong Kong, or military power, right? So prosperity, I think, it all depends upon your frame. I'd say the cities that are the most interesting to study as on that question, like in terms of their impact and their influence, tend to be the global cities, right? The cosmopolitan cities, and they tend to share a lot of similar opportunities and challenges. And so that's, in a way, that's the most interesting for me, because you can compare them across cultures.
True. So prosperity is not just how the intensity of the prosper, but rather cultural, holistic approach to consider what prosperity is. Yeah, I agree with that.
Just like an individual, right? You can be very, very rich, but not necessarily be prosperous if you're not happy, or well-rounded, or right, connected to many interesting things going on. So, but yeah, I mean, I suppose one could Google various different metrics, and you get the usual suspects, right? But you might be surprised, because per capita, there are some very small cities that, because of very weird twists of fate, make a lot of money. There might be cities in Switzerland or Luxembourg, because they're tax havens, that actually per capita are very wealthy, or very industrial cities where people don't necessarily want to go there for quality of life, but that produce a lot of goods and are therefore very prosperous. Probably the ones where the most money moves through are those global financial capitals like New York, Hong Kong, London, right, where there are a lot of financial transactions going on. That's one metric of prosperity.
Yeah, exactly. Like personal success across cultures is also different. Like at least in Asia where I live, the personal success is depend on how many cars you have, right, how many houses you have, something like that. But also in Europe, it's quite different. So similar with the personal success in modern era and also ancient and medieval times, I think prosperity of the city goes along with the line, I think.
Absolutely. And you put me in mind of something. I'm looking at the background behind you, which is of New York City. And the other thing that cities drive, which is related to prosperity, is proximity. Cities exist because people want to be proximate to certain things. So, for instance, and I'll just stick with New York because I know it the best. One of the reasons why you have so many tall buildings in Lower Manhattan is because early on, Wall Street was established as a financial center. The first bank of the United States, the first national bank, was set up on Wall Street. Alexander Hamilton's bank was on Wall Street. Aaron Burr's bank was near Wall Street. So very early on, the banks are there, and people who wanted to have exchange with the people who ran the banks, there was no internet, there was no telephone, needed to be near those other people. So proximity to wealth and proximity to power and proximity to status drive density, because if you want to be close to someone, you need to create enough housing for all those people who want to be near that center of prosperity or power. And so if you look at at the skyline of New York, it is to a large degree a graph of power or status. The buildings get taller when people either want to live or work proximate to other prosperous, powerful people. So Midtown, and there are other reasons. It has to do with geology and it has to do with zoning, but to a large extent, you had a financial center in Lower Manhattan. People wanted to be near JP Morgan. And so they built tall buildings there because they needed to have offices near JP Morgan. So it's just one other aspect of prosperity that drives the shape of cities.
Yeah, it's something like a distant decay, people tend to, approach closer to more hospitable environments, and that's interesting.
Exactly.
And then moving on to another question, like if you are to describe 3 adjectives of the 3 characteristics of the city that made a Homo sapiens such a successful species in Earth, which 3 adjectives would you choose? Like we talked about proximity. Other than that.
So proximity, which is a noun, but so you have proximity and density. Those are 2 nouns, but the 3 adjectives, I guess, would be tolerant, collaborative, and creative.
Creative, yeah.
So you and I spoke beforehand, and I sent you the 5 lenses that we use for our program, right? And so one is these are the things we look at everything through when we're studying the city. So there's the form of the city was one lens, because it's about planning and architecture and grids and how you organize functions of a city. There's the resilient city, which is about environmental sustainability, environmental justice, climate change, sea level rise, asthma, energy, all of that, right? Recycling. Resilient city. There's the just city, which is about social justice and how you organize the city so that it serves more people more equitably. There's resilient city, form of the city, just city, city of memory. The city contains memory, it contains history, it contains statues and memorials, over which in America we're having a lot of debates over whose stories get told and how they get told. But it contains memory, which creates identity, right? And then maybe the most important is the city of creativity. Because of all those synergies which are created by all that diversity, all sorts of interesting things emerge. Jazz, as we know it, yes, it comes from the Mississippi. It comes from, all sorts of inputs, but it gets consolidated in New Orleans, and it gets disseminated in Chicago and New York and Cincinnati, right? So jazz exists because of cities. Broadway, we call it Broadway, right? We name it by a street that runs up the spine of New York, of Manhattan. Broadway theater is invented because of the diversity and the tolerance and creativity of an immigrant city, right? It has, and a migrant city. It has Black culture in it. It has Jewish culture in it. It has Italian culture in it. It has Irish culture in it. It has, I think most famously right now, Puerto Rican culture in it, right? Hamilton. You don't get a Hamilton without New York City. So I think creativity might be the most important word.
Yeah, because, creativity is one of the ways to self-express for the different ethnicities and ways to express oneself as an individual. And in order to a city to be tolerant and collaborative and to unite into one, I think expression is also very important. So
absolutely,
those three adjectives you mentioned are all intertwined to make Homo sapiens.
That's a great observation. Yeah, they're all kind of sides of the same coin. They're all you don't have one without the others.
True, because if the city is tolerant, people give up more space and people become more open-minded to different creations, right? Like when you look at like other cities that is closed-minded, people cannot fully express what's in their mind because most of them they get tabooed. Yeah.
Yes, and I think there, in the 19th century, there were all sorts of, this big cities, metropolises were new, right? At least big modern cities where there was industry and automobiles and transit and tall buildings. And so there was a lot of discussion about cities, especially in Europe and, after the Industrial Revolution. And there was this term which people used, which was called anomie, which is a French word, which anomie, anomie, which was a sad term. It was this term about the anonymity that drives a certain sadness when you're in the city. You feel like you're not seen because there are so many people around you. And that was a new experience to be lost amidst all those people, right? But there's a flip side of that, which is when you're in a small town, everybody knows you, but everybody knows you within a very specific framework, whether it's religious or cultural or familial, right? Everybody knows you as the son of so-and-so or as the daughter or as the mother of so-and-so. And that determines your identity. When you go to the city, you're liberated by that anonymity and you can choose to be whom you want to be. So there is both a burden that's created by the size of a metropolis and an opportunity, which is to redefine yourself. One of the most famous books in American literature is The Great Gatsby. And Gatsby comes to New York and nobody really knows who he is. He completely reinvents himself. And you find out that he's lied about his past completely to become a new person for good or for ill. And there is that opportunity in the city. So yeah, you can feel a little bit lost and a little bit anonymous, but at the same time, you can shape your destiny and you can be liberated to become whom you want to be if the city is tolerant and collaborative and, all those things we talked about.
Yeah, city definitely can be a place for urban melancholy, but also a land of opportunity. Yeah, I think that's right. It's double-sided coin. Yeah, exactly. So it's a bit personal question, but if you can go back to a certain period of time in human history, which city would you want to visit the most and who would you want to meet there and hang out?
So many. It's such a great question. There's so many questions I have I would like to answer. There's one which is very personal to me. I have for many years I don't just teach about cities, I teach art history and architectural history. And there is a whole school of thought that has emerged around the intentions of the creators of the Acropolis in Athens. Ictinus, Callicrates, and Phidias, architects and sculptors who were commissioned by Pericles in the golden age of Athens to transform the old city, which was up high, which is why it's called Acropolis, that means high city, into a kind of, it was the old, it was at first the old city, and then it became the religious center, and then it became the artistic center of Athens during its golden age. And there are all sorts of arguments about why the Parthenon is designed a certain way, and the placement of the buildings, and its relationship to the rest of the city. And I would love to talk to them to answer some questions that I have about the architecture and design of the Acropolis.
What question do you have? Like, what's the most?
They're very arcane questions. Very arcane questions. So, for instance, there are these things called refinements of the Parthenon. The Parthenon, the columns have something called entasis, which means they bulge a little bit, which is, we believe, was to correct for the optical effect of columns looking concave when they're next to each other, when there's space in between them, so that if you make them bulge, it makes them look straight. But we don't know if that's why what entasis was done for. The platform of the Parthenon is actually curved. It's not flat, right? And we believe that that's because the top of the Acropolis is curved, and if you made it flat, it would look like it's bowing. It would look like it's sagging. But we don't know. The orders that they use Ionic order on the inside, in the cella, on the inside of the building, but they use a Doric order on the outside. It's a feminine deity, Athena. They're supposed to use the Ionic with feminine deities, but they use the Doric. We have theories about why that is. That's supposedly manifesting the masculine and the feminine attributes of Athena. We don't know. So there are all sorts of questions I have about that. And after teaching it for many years, I would just kind of I would love to go there and go, oh, no. There's completely different reasons. You have no idea. You don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Those kind of like ancient Greek, ancient Athens have like scientific mysteries that we cannot decipher easily. And then definitely you are really curious about those kind of things. Why do you think is studying history such important to know more about urban? Like, why is knowing about the past so important?
There's this old cliche that those who do not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. I don't actually believe that, because I don't think the lessons you learn from the past are to, there was a solution 100 years ago, we can use the same solution now, right? Or there was a problem 100 years ago, we now know how to deal with that problem, because history is a river and things are constantly changing. I do believe, though, and this is a paraphrase of a historian from the American West, William Appleman Williams. You learn history to learn the origins of your constraints, so you can liberate yourself.
Wow, that's beautiful.
So, in other words, what kind of constraints do we have about gender that we've inherited from our parents and their parents that we need to understand so we can move beyond them, right? So we are no longer a sexist society. That's just one example, right? And I think the city is history built. Right? Every generation doesn't just wipe the slate clean and build a new city. There are economics and politics and social and cultural attitudes built into the infrastructure and structure of the city. You can't change that. So we have to understand what's built into the city to see what's constraining us, so we can either change our behaviors or change the city to liberate us to grow and change, to adapt to new circumstances. And so I think history, you need to understand history to be able to free yourself from history in a way.
Oh, yeah. To able to reflect about the constraints, as you said, and then also to be free from those issues that is brought up by, constraints. Yeah. Talking about the resilience, as you mentioned about the reflection on the past and how we can do better in the present, and future. You mentioned about the 5 lenses of city as your living city project. I'll briefly mention because you explained before the form of the city, resilient city, the just city, city of memory, and the city of creativity. And I'm curious about the resilient city today because, as you said, we have to learn something from the past, right? And then right now, there is the outbreak of COVID. And then before COVID, the resilience of the city has to do most with the sustainability and the economic crisis, how we can deal better with those. But how has the outbreak of the virus changed the standard of the resilience of the city right now?
Oof. So as you correctly point out, right, resilience is a more robust notion than sustainability. Sustainability tends to live mostly within the question of environmental sustainability. How do you change behaviors and change structures and institutions and systems so that a future generation can enjoy the same or better comforts and opportunities as a present generation? That's sustainability. Resilience, I think, includes more than the environmental question, right? Are the businesses resilient? Are the individuals resilient? Are the communities resilient? So for instance, flooding in the Red Hook neighborhood of Brooklyn is a question of environmental sustainability and a question of environmental resilience. But one of the reasons flooding in Red Hook was hard to recover from, it wasn't just that it was low and near the water, which it is, but it was also that there are working class people living in public housing projects and wealthier people living in market rate housing near the water. And the two groups don't communicate very well with each other. And therefore, when an emergency happens, it's difficult for them to collaborate on a solution and cooperate. And we learned that after Hurricane Sandy. And so one of the things which will make Red Hook more resilient isn't just, building higher seawalls or creating more permeable surfaces to absorb sea level rise, but it's also bringing more economic and educational resources into the working class neighborhood. It's also developing bridges between the wealthier and the less wealthy people in Red Hook. It's also developing civic organizations that bring people together so they can collaborate on solving problems. So I think that's just a background to the question of resilience. Now, you asked about the pandemic. Cities were hardest hit because cities are dense and disease spreads faster in dense. This has been true forever. You can go back to the Black Death in the Middle Ages, to the cholera epidemics in the 19th centuries. Cities, epidemiology was invented because of cities, right? You have to learn about large-scale public health epidemics because of cities. But cities are also the places where you come up with the solutions to those and where you develop. We were in New York during the pandemic. In our neighborhood, everyone wore a mask. And the minute you could get vaccinated, everyone wanted to get vaccinated, with some exceptions. But and you must know that in the United States, that was not those two conditions did not obtain in all of America's cities or states. So I think specifically in terms of New York, questions about whether people are coming back to the office, questions about tourism and whether people are going to go to theaters and museums and restaurants, questions about dense urban transportation like the subway system. Those were all impacted severely by the pandemic. It looks like tourism's coming back. People are coming back because you can do a lot of things outdoors and because the reopening of theaters looks like it's been successful. It'll take probably a year or two, but I think that will come back. And that generates a lot of New York's revenue now is tourism. The
Yeah.
office is a trickier question. I think we were already undergoing a revision of our ideas about office work and its necessity. And Gio, you should, of all people, be familiar with Zoom because I was working with you guys in China and with other schools in Washington, D.C. and New York. I was on Zoom 2 years. I was doing most of my work on Zoom 2 years before the pandemic,
Yeah.
as you guys were. But we've developed the capacity for doing that, and that will affect the numbers of people who decide to come into the office. And office work generates a lot of ancillary income for restaurants and for the transportation system in New York City. So I think that's the biggest impact is the question of how and whether we return to the office. And if we don't, what do we adapt that space for? Does that become residential space? Does that become public space? Does that become cultural space? New York City has always adapted to these crises. It's not like this is the first time. The cholera epidemics drove a lot of wealthy people out of New York City in the middle of the 19th century. They all came back. So the question is how people come back and being creative. We have a new mayor. So how do we think creatively? There's that word again about how we readapt our spaces to new uses.
Yeah. So it's the matter of returning back to the previous before the outbreak of COVID-19. Then
No, I think it's about something new. I think it's
something
about
new, also coming up with new solutions and innovations to cope with the virus. Yeah.
I think so. And so can an office building be adapted to be artists' housing or schools or cultural institutions or just residential? I think that's going to have to be on the table.
In human history, has there been any incidents or events that dramatically impacted like a urban environment, just like COVID-19?
Oh my God, yes. I mean, New York is the easiest for me. We had 2 cholera epidemics in the 1840s and 50s. A great fire, which destroyed in the early 19th century, I think 1825, that destroyed all of Dutch New York. All the wooden buildings were gone in New York City. There was a great fire in Chicago, which infamous, that forced the city to be completely rebuilt. Earthquakes, obviously, and fires in San Francisco. Abroad, the mass movements of people, the sacking of Rome. I mean, cities, the Black Death, Genghis Khan. I mean, cities, because they're loci of power and wealth, are objects of all sorts of, power grabs, but also just public health and natural disasters. So, in New York's case, each time it's come back stronger. That sounds a little glib, but historically it's true, because there's this notion in urban history called creative destruction, and sometimes it's used as justification for some very nasty stuff like urban renewal, but generally speaking, it means that often to create dramatic change, which can be very positive, you have to destroy something first. And while I would never have wished for the pandemic to have occurred, and we've all lost people, and many of us have suffered incredibly difficult period in our collective and personal lives, there are opportunities. I was just reading this morning about the curbside restaurants. Right. So curbside restaurants were an emergency measure to help restaurants survive, because people would only eat out if they could eat outdoors. They didn't want to be indoors during the pandemic. So now what do you do with all those outdoor dining pavilions that are in the street? They're taking up a little bit of parking. They're causing some challenges in terms of public safety. They're not all built particularly well. Some of them are pretty ugly. There's noise, there's public health issues, there are rats because of the food out in the city streets. But thousands of people stay working and hundreds of restaurants stay functioning. And they transformed the streetscape in some very positive ways as well. And there's a new program called Open Streets, which the Department of Transportation permits neighborhoods to petition to close off a street, either permanently or temporarily, to occupy it with pedestrian uses. That's a very positive outcome of the pandemic. So I think, Gio, the trick is, how do we hold on to those things, those positive things which have emerged out of the destruction, and let go of the things which are problematic, and how do we make them safer and more equitable and more inclusive of people from different backgrounds.
Exactly. And like, city is such vulnerable places, especially to viruses, because as you mentioned about the density plays a huge role in, because humans are gathered in one such a big place. And then in such crisis, I think being, once again, collaborative, more tolerant to other people is very important in these cases.
I think absolutely. Oh, so go ahead.
Yeah, you can speak.
Oh no, I just think, because I know we're moving towards closure here. In a global world, the way that the planet survives is through cooperation. Yeah. And empathy. True. There is no other place on the planet. There are no other places on the planet that can cultivate those skills better than cities. So if we can't make cities work, we're doomed. We're not going to move out of cities. Yes. That's not sustainable. That's not kind to the planet. That's not culturally sustainable. That's not economically sustainable. Cities are the future, even though cities, especially as the pandemic have shown, present significant challenges. So if we can't make cities work, that's it for the human race. Yeah. Lastly, do you have any recommendations for books or like films on listeners who want to know more about the urbanism? Yes, and I'll send you a list. We actually have a 2-page Google list of movies. Wow. About New York City. So there are a whole bunch of fiction movies that are wonderful. In terms of documentaries, I think one of the most interesting documentaries about the city is Ken Burns' New York series. It's a 7 or 8 episode. It's available on Amazon and actually it's available on YouTube as well. It's just called New York, and it's a documentary by Ken Burns. There's a wonderful book which is out of print, but you can get it online, by A.E.G. Morris. This is very nerdy. It's called The History of Urban Form. And it just looks at different cities around the world and how they evolved. And I think it's just the cat's meow. It's great. A.E.G. Morris, History of Urban Form. For a slightly livelier nonfiction story about a city, there's a book about Robert Moses, who was a city planner in New York City. I think I may have assigned a chapter of it to you once, Gio. It's called The Power Broker, and it's by Robert Caro. And then for fun, for a movie about New York City infrastructure, the third Die Hard movie. Do you know the Die Hard series? Yeah. It's called Die Hard with a Vengeance. And basically the movie is all about this weird scavenger hunt all around New York City that Bruce Willis has to solve before bombs go off. And it's basically must have been written, I've never looked into it, but it was written by someone who loves New York, because it's all about Yankee Stadium and the subway system and the underground tunnels and the grid and Harlem. And anyway, that's a great movie and a fun movie about New York City infrastructure. Yeah. For Living City Project, which
kind of like young people do you recommend joining the team of Living City Project?
Thank you for that. That's a lovely question. So the Living City Project has a series of programs. We have programs for high schoolers, for college students, and for adults. I think for your audience, and certainly for your friends, and especially for your peers who were with us in the CEP, the City Gap program. It's a program for students who are taking a gap year between high school and college, or are taking a semester or year off from college. And it's basically every day we're out in the city doing field work. We're looking at the city as a text, as a laboratory, as a studio. It's a place, we're looking at the city as a place for learning, but also for making and for having an impact on these questions that you and I have been discussing of resilience and justice and creativity. And it's all based in hands-on learning and experiential learning, which means we're going out and we're connecting with policymakers and politicians and advocates and activists and environmentalists and artists and experts and professionals in the city to learn from them, but also to collaborate with them on these sort of existential questions in New York City. And it's a great opportunity to think about what you're going to do in college, to think about what you're going to do in your careers, and also to establish relationships with, potential mentors in a variety of different disciplines. So we think it's a really great experience for young people who maybe want to take a little bit of time away from more traditional learning.
Mm-hmm. Lastly, do you have any a brief advice for those young people who want to live the best out of the city and explore more on urban life?
Oh my goodness.
Own advice.
In any city, I think the first thing you need to do is figure out the transit system. And invest some time in understanding how to safely and easily move around the city. The very first thing you should do, get a map, map out the transit system, how you can cheaply move around, and then ask someone to sit down with you and tell you who lives where. That's the first thing I do when I get to a city that I don't know, is I sit down with someone who knows it and I lay out a paper map and I give them colored markers. And I'm like, where are the rich people? Where are the poor people? Where are the white people? Where are the black people? Where are the artists? Where are the hipsters? Where are the financiers? Where are the, performers? Where are the old people, right? Where are the public spaces? It's just get them to mark up a map so you get some idea of the social geography, and then get into the public transit system and explore.
Yeah, that's a really great advice to immerse oneself into a city environment. Thank you so much for the conversation today. I really learned a lot. I know how the urban history and also the characteristics of the successful cities, and also I should I should prepare a map before I move to travel city. That's a really great advice. Thanks again.
My pleasure, Gio. And your questions were spot on and really generated a lot of interesting thinking for me. So I want to thank you for that and congratulate you on a really effective interview.
Thank you.